So what will happen if something happens that threatens us, whether that threat is real or imagined, we will activate our sympathetic nervous system, and then that's going to activate our flight response, which will try to run from the threat first, or the fight response. If we can't run from it, we will turn and fight it, okay? If we cannot do either of these, mainly as children, they cannot run from their parents and they cannot fight their parents, then they will go into what's called a flooding experience, where they might experience panic, rage, terror, intense emotions, but they can't do anything with them. They just feel them inside themselves. That will often lead them into what's called the immobility response, where they freeze, go numb, dissociate, or fawning. Fawning is where you appease the abuser as a way of trying to mitigate the abuse. All human beings do this, and this is wonderful, actually, that we have these defense mechanisms. They actually keep us alive. So that's very useful. The issue is that once we experience these, we're only supposed to stay in them for a short period of time to survive the threat. But if the threat is a prolonged threat, we end up living in this state, which is exhausting to the nervous system, okay? Normally what will happen is after the threat is no longer there, by the nature, first of all, I want to tell you, all of these unconscious defensive responses have both a psychological and a somatic expression. The living organism does not separate neurology from physiology. They function in unison. So as you have each of these defenses, your body is contracting and becoming tight and defensive in the muscle tissue itself that's associated with whatever emotion that you're having at the time of the threat. Now, when safety is reintroduced, the human organism is neurophysiologically designed to disengage our defensive responses and return to the baseline. So this should happen automatically. The nervous system wants to turn this off because it should be used only temporarily, wants to turn this off, and it wants to come back down into this nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, of social engagement. And this is normal for us. However, what happens is when we start to come down, when we come out of this freeze response, we will experience or re-experience the flooding, meaning the emotions that we felt, panic, rage, or terror, will start to surface. Now, recovery in many modalities sometimes result in temporary increase in symptoms, which is here, even when the process is going well. So when I'm working with a client who comes to me in a freeze response, then they start feeling terror, I know they're coming out of freeze. That's good, but it feels horrible. This is the state here that we call the post-traumatic stress cycle of re-traumatization. So I start to come out of freeze, but it's so overwhelming and uncomfortable, I go back into numbness again. But my nervous system wants to come back out of that. But this is overwhelming, so I go back into numbness. How do we go into numbness? We can dissociate, we could take drugs, we could have sex, we could drink alcohol, anything at all that numbs us out, so I don't have to feel the terror and rage in me. This cycle, if it persists long enough, is the cycle of suicidal ideation, because what happens is a person lives in a state of having either no feelings or overwhelming feelings. This, unfortunately, is what happens to many military people who commit suicide. They had to go into dissociation when they were at war, but when they come home and they start to feel safe, they come out and they begin to feel the terror and rage. They don't want to express this on their family, so they numb themselves out again. And they stay in this cycle long enough, they have nothing to live for, because the only two states they can experience are no feelings or overwhelming feelings. Up here is usual suicidal ideation, lethargy, depression, lack of engagement. Whereas down here, there's anger, aggression, terror, anxiety, rage. When we're coming out of this, and all of us will do this, when we come out of this is when we actually need someone to help us co-regulate, someone who can understand our feelings, accept our feelings, and ground us in these overwhelming feelings. This is when co-regulation is necessary. This is when a lot of people go into therapy. They do this until they can come underneath this line where they can now self-regulate, okay? And so that the tremor mechanism, I don't know how many of you are familiar with TRE, trauma releasing exercises, but it activates a tremor mechanism in the body, which you can see at my YouTube channel, David Berceli. The tremor mechanism in the body seems to be an integral part of discharging the specific myofascial, which is muscle and fascia, tension patterns associated with the defensive responses of the body. If you don't understand things that I've just said here, because I don't know your level of familiarity with some of these subjects, please write down your questions and we'll go over this during our Q&A. So this is the cycle of post-traumatic stress. This is a wonderful cycle. We are born with this ability, and this ability keeps us alive. So it's not bad. The only bad thing is when we end up living this cycle our entire life. Many of us could live it for 20 or 30 years if we were traumatized as children. We don't even know that we're frozen or numb. So we want this cycle to protect us, but we want to be able to come back out of it. So now let's look at what happens to us up here, and then how do we bring ourselves back down to here? So up here, as a child, because I lived in a fearful environment, I did a lot of daydreaming, internal reflection, and fantasizing. I did this all the time. I was always in my head. It was the safest place to be. Later, as I grew up, this daydreaming started to turn into intuition. I could intuit when things were dangerous. Internal reflection now became imagination, or creativity, and fantasizing became imagination. So I actually used this as defensive mechanisms, but I matured in developing these qualities in myself. Then, as I grew even older, this helped me expand into what we call higher or expanded consciousness. I had expanded awareness, or as some athletes would say, I was in the zone, meaning somehow this, which becomes a defensive mechanism as a child, actually has some really possible potential for us as growing human beings in consciousness. The only difficulty with all of this is that it is a loss of boundaries, which is the dorsal vagus nerve. So I still don't have boundaries here. I'm still too available and open to people's energy, abusing my energy field, because I don't have boundaries still. So what we need to do in terms of recovery is we have to get rid of the fear, the anxiety, and the disturbing emotions that forced us up into this dissociated state. We have to resolve these, take these away, and we come to what we call grounded. So I take all of these anxieties away and I become grounded. But post-traumatic growth said there's something more than just being grounded. What happens is we have to go through what's called a transformation point. This is what Joe Dispenza calls it, reframing the experience, the point of a new perspective, or disillusion to evolution is what Stephen Porges calls it. Meaning we have to come back down here, but we don't come down here just to get grounded. We actually take all of this experience and we transform it, or we reframe it. We get a new perspective. And what Porges says, it brings us from the disillusionment of life, which is what we experienced here, to evolution. Now let's look at that. All of these qualities, once you take away the disturbing emotions, you bring them down into expansion of boundaries rather than a loss of boundaries. We're now back into the ventral vagus nerve, and all of this that we developed for 18 years as a child now becomes pure skill. So we've taken away these disturbing emotions, but we have all of this amazing human quality that we created while we were up here, and we got rid of these disturbing emotions, and now they're pure skills. They're available to us, okay? So this is what happens when a person truly recovers from trauma. They don't just ground themselves, they actually transform themselves. And this is what Porges says is part of the evolution of the human species. So let's look at this a little further. So here's our nervous system again. So, and here's our point of transformation. Now, research on post-traumatic growth has demonstrated that people who recover from trauma and go through this transformation point, most people bounce back at least to their baseline. Some emerge from the disaster stronger and better, at least in some ways. So something has transformed, something has changed this person. And that the grief experience in some ways forces people to become different people, and that the new person is sometimes better than the old one. And the last part, which is interesting, is when the vagus nerve is highly stimulated, people report having had spiritual experiences. So what happens is not only do we recover from the trauma, something in the human process helps us transform all of those experiences that we would call negative. And not only do they become positive experiences, but somehow they become growthful. They actually help us connect not to ourselves, but to all of humanity and expanded consciousness to other potential dimensions or other levels of consciousness. Trauma, as much as I hate to say it, because I don't want to propose that we need to be traumatized, I'm proposing that it appears that in life we are traumatized, but that trauma is not necessarily only negative. It is used to help us evolve. Now, what this does is it separates mostly what's up here is the rational mind, because we were in our brain up here all the time, to what's called the intuitive mind, which actually comes from the heart. If you read a lot of heart math research, they're discovering how the intuitive mind actually informs the rational mind. And the intuitive mind comes from the heart. So we're actually coming from our head down into our heart, and this forces us to become different people.